My guest today is Atif Mian. Atif is a professor of economics at Princeton and has become one of the foremost experts on the relationship between financial markets and the macroeconomy. He's the author of the acclaimed book House of Debt, where he argues that the gigantic increase in household debt was the primary driver of the crash of 2008.
Hello, Atif. You've been doing some of the most influential research on the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis, on indebtedness and on what's going on with this current crisis. When you were writing about so it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thanks very much. When the financial crisis happened, you wrote a book called The House of Debt on what caused the Great Recession and how to prevent future recurrences. Can you tell us what is, in your view, what are the two or three main views about why the great financial crisis took place, and why, in your view, the deterioration of households' balance sheets of the debt position of households is the one that empirically makes more sense?
Yes, absolutely. Let me take a step back somewhat from the great financial crisis, and I'm doing that partly because I want to tie in the financial crisis of 2008 to the events today, which I'm sure we'll be talking about going forward. I want to start the story from the 1980s, if you will, because something very interesting started to happen from the 1980s onwards in financial markets. And the financial crisis of 2008 was very much a consequence of those forces. So that's why I'm going back a little bit in time. We know now, with hindsight at least, that something structurally shifts, certainly in the US economy, but to some extent globally as well. And that is this rise in extreme inequality. And by extreme inequality, I mean the share of income going to the top 1%, and they start accumulating not just a higher and higher share of income, but also a higher and higher share of wealth in the overall economy. Now, one natural consequence of that process, given the financial system that we have, which is primarily credit or debt-based, if you will. So when people at the very top accumulate more and more assets, they tend to disproportionately hold those assets through debt instruments, fixed income instruments. And so correspondingly, from 1980 onwards, there's another trend that starts to show up, which is, along with this rise in extreme inequality, we also start to see a rise in credit, overall credit as a share of the economy, total credit to GDP, if you will. And that also starts to boom along with the rise in inequality. And early on, that rise in credit is disproportionately concentrated in the private sector, and then within the private sector in the household sector space. And so what you see is, you see this rise in household credit to GDP, not just in the US, but in many other advanced economies of the world, for example, Spain, being a very well-known example. And all of those advanced economies, they start seeing a rise in household credit at a scale that we had not seen before, really. And so that kept building up. One important aspect which we talked about in our earlier work when we referred to the financial crisis of 2008 was that rise in household credit was not concentrated in the top 1% who are becoming richer and richer. If they are the ones getting all this, borrowing all this debt, you might say, well, they're becoming richer, so they can kind of, they have higher income, lifetime income, and they can pay for it, and there's nothing much to worry about. What was worrying in the national statistics, if you will, was that this rise in household credit was skewed towards those segments of the population that were not growing at the fastest pace in terms of their income per capita. And so the real burden of debt, if you will, was rising even faster than what aggregate statistics like credit to GDP might suggest. So this is the situation that was building up. And the other piece which is important to keep in mind is, you might ask another question, which is, well, if those who were borrowing were not seeing their incomes rise as fast as the top, why were they able to borrow? Why was the financial sector not intervening and telling them, look, stop, you can't borrow anymore? And the basic answer to that question is that they were able to borrow because interest rates kept falling. And so that's the third variable I want to keep in mind. So again, just to remind everyone, the first was rising inequality. The second one is rising credit or financialization of the economy, if you will. And the third important variable to keep in mind to understand the bigger story is the fall in the interest rate. Why is the fall in interest rate important? Well, for two reasons. The first is that for the same level of income, a lower interest rate allows you to borrow more, and that's what those people were doing. But there's a second very important consequence of lower interest rates, which is that lower interest rate raises asset prices, and in particular, housing values. And so, again, the people below the top 1% and so on, they were able to borrow because the main collateral that they had, which is housing, kept rising in value, and they were essentially borrowing against it, either directly or indirectly. This is the situation that kept building up until 2008. And then what happens on the eve of 2008, essentially 2007, is that housing market starts to collapse, starts to go down. We can get into the reasons of that, but I think those reasons are essentially not that important for the question at hand. Once that happens, this dynamic loop that was going on, which was more credit against housing, that slowed down and then reversed. This class of households could not borrow more, and that caused the recession, essentially. But why a recession? Because they cut back on their spending. So there was all of a sudden a deficiency in demand, because all of this borrowing that I was referring to was essentially financing aggregate demand in the economy from 1980s onwards. And that process kind of collapsed, which led to the recession of 2008.
I want to go to those solutions and also to our role in designing them, but I want to first spend some time on the current shock, the COVID shock, which I don't know if to your surprise or not, but it has even increased largely the forces that you worry about. Saving rates have increased, but they have increased in a very, very heterogeneous manner, with a lot of that saving increase being accumulated by the wealthiest segments of the population. For example, in France, 2/3 of the savings accumulated since confinement went to the 20% wealthiest people. So also government debt has significantly increased. So do you believe that the COVID shock has actually exacerbated the rich savings that you've been talking about and you describe in your current work?
Absolutely. I think one very important, in my mind, actually the most important attribute of the COVID crisis, which is of course global in nature, first of all. 2008 crisis was also global in nature, but this one is actually even more global, I believe, in nature than that. But the most important attribute of the COVID crisis, which makes it a lot more dangerous than the 2008 crisis, is the unequal experience of this crisis. It's really remarkable. If you look at the loss of earnings, for example, take the US, for the top 1 or the 10% versus the rest, you always have both those groups suffering, but they tend to kind of go, to some extent at least, go together. This time, this is like the Zoom recession. Like you and I, who can continue to do our work over Zoom, we are largely unaffected, at least relatively, I would say. But people who depend on personal contact and so on, which tends to be relatively lower earning occupations, they have been brutally decimated as a result of this crisis. So that gap of how people have been hit, it's really remarkable when you look at those graphs. This recession versus the last 3-4 recessions in comparison. And for everything that we have just talked about, but now go back, go back 30, 40 years and look at the source of our structural problems, which is this unequitable growth and this buildup of inequality. And now add to that this big crisis that has even further separated, if you will, the haves from the have-nots. So it just doubles down on the same sort of break that the economy and the society was facing. So I do feel that the urgency of addressing these issues, it was always there, but it's even more so now than before.